Hey there, my name is Jasmine Sky, and I'm here today with the promised Q&A video that I said I was going to make in my video where I talked about how I got my book deal, which I will link up there, and also the video about me announcing my book deal. Those are two different videos. But yes, I am a soon-to-be published author of queer YA fantasy. My debut novel called Daughter of the Bone Forest is coming out with File and Friends in winter 2024. And I'm here today to answer the questions that got sent in to me via YouTube and Twitter for this first ever Q&A. Before I get started on the questions though, I did want to talk about sort of the political situation and the world situation that is happening right now, both with Ukraine and also with the attack on trans youth in Texas. So I'm gonna add some links at the top of that list. We need to fight back for our trans youth in Texas and in the United States, period. And I'm also going to add some links for helping Ukrainians, Ukrainian refugees, for helping Ukraine itself, also in my description. So check out that section of my description that has the causes that need your support, and those are two very important causes that are deeply in need right now. Okay, so I am going to be looking down. I have my iPad here with all of the questions I will be answering, so I'm going to be reading from that. So if I look down while I'm reading, that's why. I did not script any of my answers, so hopefully this isn't too rough, but I'm just going to give my honest answers to these questions that I got. So we're going to start with the YouTube questions. I did kind of get two questions on my video on YouTube where I asked for questions, and I got more questions on Twitter. The first one, it was not really a question, but I did kind of want to respond to it publicly, and that was from Angela Wisneski, and this says, I really loved watching all of Lascelles Sambury's debut diaries, not suggesting you copy her, but I would love to hear your experience with editing, covers, marketing, and so on, since everyone's experience is different. I know some of those topics are very far in your future though. I love this suggestion. I love Lascelles Sambury's debut diaries. Lascelles' debut came out last year. It is right over here, Blood Like Magic. It's kind of in the corner right there. The debut diaries that Lascelles created throughout her debut year were really cool and really useful for me as an aspiring author to listen to and watch. So I'm gonna link that playlist down below as well if you're interested. I haven't decided yet if I'm gonna be titling it something catchy like Debut Diaries or if I am just going to make videos as things come up, like a video talking about how I've been doing editing with my editor and things like that. Maybe I'll see if Lascelles cares if I copy her debut diaries like titling. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Okay, the next question, the first actual question, is from Moon Petrie. The question was, as I'm currently querying a middle grade queer contemporary, I'm curious about whether / how your queerness and your book's queerness shaped any decisions you made or experiences you had through the querying / getting agented / R&R / submission / book deal process. Yes, that's a great question for anyone with any type of marginalized identity. Of course, not all, this is gonna sound terrible, not all marginalized identities are created equal in the sense of things you need to be careful about and things you need to be very aware of. Being a white queer person is definitely puts me in a more safe space than, for instance, queer people of color. So I just want to go ahead and say that and be very aware of that. But as a white queer person, especially as someone who exists kind of on the trans spectrum, which is in general a little harder than being a cis white queer person, I was very cognizant of who I was querying. I looked at not just their manuscript wish list, because there are a lot of agents who say that they want LGBTQIA+ books. I was especially very cognizant of the agents who said they wanted LGBT books and they cut it off at the T, because that's not as inclusive. There's quite a lot of identities that you're excluding when you just cut it off at the T. Of course, if you do LGBT+ to signify everything else, that's a little bit different. I personally like to do LGBTQIA+, but you can continue going. LGBTQIA PP2S+ might be the like longer, more relevant set, but I just got very used to saying LGBTQIA+ in college when I was the RA of the LGBTQIA+ dorm. So anyway, that's an aside point. I was very cognizant of agents who had in their manuscript wish lists or on their websites or in their bios that they wanted queer stories, and I did not count the agents who only said LGBT because, again, I think that shows that they're not quite as up to date with the queer community if they are only saying LGBT. I also was very aware and gave more precedence to the agents who actually published, actually had gotten book deals for their clients with queer books. One of my agent siblings, for instance, is R.B. Lemberg, who is a queer, neurodivergent, bigender author who uses they, them pronouns and has a whole series called The Birdverse, which is a queer world that has been published and is continuing to be published. The first novel in that series, called The Unbalancing, comes out in September of this year. So that was one that I looked at that I knew that my agent repped a bigender author, which was pretty big for me as a bigender person. And then another agent sibling, C.L. Clark, is a queer person of color, and their debut, which is a sapphic North African fantasy, had already been sold by the time I was querying my agent. So I knew not only that my agent wanted and repped queer authors, I also knew that she repped more diverse queer authors, being a neurodivergent queer author and a queer author of color, and that she could sell books by queer authors, which is the other step above that, right? So that all sort of went into my decision. And the other agents I queried were also all people who either were queer themselves or had success with queer authors or made it very clear in their manuscript wish list that they understood and wanted to support the queer community and the sort of all the intersections of the queer community. That was all very important to me. So step number one was finding an agent who would support me, who would understand my sort of particular intersections of queer identity, being someone who is bigender, who is on the A spectrum, and who's pretty gay in sort of all vectors that can be interpreted. So I'm going to be writing books that are extremely queer, and I wanted an agent who would support that. So that was part of my querying process, was being very clear in my bio, for instance, my queer identities. This was something that every queer author has to decide what they're comfortable with. I am very out and proud for the most part, even amongst my family and coworkers. I'm not super out about the bigender thing in the professional spaces of my job, but it's also not something that I take great pains in hiding. It's just something that hasn't really come up because I tend to present very femininely in my professional workspace. So that being said, I am very out about being queer in sort of all vectors of my life, and I don't mind being very out about that in my query letter, in my social media presence, and all of that. So I was very upfront about that when querying, because ideally the agents who don't understand or don't agree or are not going to be a good fit will then self-select themselves out. One of the really great things that my agent did when we had the first offer call is that she asked me about my pronouns. So that showed me straight up that she was, you know, willing and able to understand queer identities, right? So those are the kinds of things I look for, and there are a lot of really great agents who are doing really great things for queer authors, so just be more discerning when you are researching literary agents. I do have a whole video about researching literary agents and how I went about doing that, which I think is just very useful no matter what you're looking for, no matter what your identity is, what type of book that you are trying to query. Doing a lot of research is like the number one for that. I would also recommend Alexa Dunn's new video that just came out a couple days ago about the rise of scam agents in the industry, and just being very careful. Again, reasons to research very heavily and make sure that you are querying very reputable people, or people, even if they are new, from very reputable agencies. You can query a new agent who doesn't have a track record in publishing queer stories if you know that they are mentored or at an agency with authors who do, for instance. So I'm going to link Alexa Dunn's video also below Liselle's Debut Diaries playlist. I'm spending a really long time with this question. This could have been a whole other video, but the other sort of secondary parts of this are asking about how I dealt with my queerness in the R&R submissions book deal process. My agent and I did have very frank conversations when we were going on submission about putting together an editor list of editors who are known to publish queer stories or are looking for queer narratives to publish. For instance, the editor that I ended up getting, Holly West, I specifically told my agent that I wanted to sub to Holly because of Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas, because Aiden Thomas is a trans author of color and is writing queer trans stories, and that showed me that Holly is an editor who respects those narratives, and also Aiden has nothing but good things to say about his editor in his tweets and things like that, so I figure Holly would be a great choice. So I was the one that suggested Holly to my agent, but my agent also suggested a bunch of other editors that have a good track record of queer stories. That's one of the reasons you look for an agent who has a track record of selling queer stories, because they know the editors that also have a good track record of buying queer stories, right? So that all kind of went into the process, but at no point was I ever asked to diminish or take away any of the queer aspects of my story. And if I ever had been in any of the R&Rs, in any of the rejections I got from an editor, in any conversations with my agent, if I'd ever been asked to do that, that would have been a serious red flag. And that never happened to me, which showed me that my choice in my agent and my agent's choice in editors was good. I just kicked my camera. Ooh. Okay, let's move on to the next series of questions from Twitter. The first set I'm gonna put up here. This is by my Twitter friend slash mutual, Lara Amin. The first one is, did you feel that Daughter of the Bone Forest was going to be your debut slash the book, or were you preparing to go out on sub with a different book? If you've been following my YouTube channel, you will know that yes, I have been working on other books. I oscillated between feeling like Daughter of the Bone Forest was it and feeling like it wasn't. There was a time definitely when I was actually very worried about it being my debut because it didn't feel right or ready. But if you watch my video talking about my R&R process, you'll know that I feel very differently now, and all of the R&Rs that I went through on Daughter of the Bone Forest got it to this point now where I'm very proud of it as a debut. So actually coming off of the last R&R I did, which was my R&R for my editor, I was very scared going into my acquisitions meeting because I really, really wanted this book to sell. I felt like it was ready and it was a good debut. The story had really taken that final step that it needed, at least sort of crossed the final threshold. There are still some other steps that are needed, but it crossed that final threshold into being a story that absolutely I believed in. So I got there eventually, and I was there at the beginning when I queried it because I wasn't going to query a book that I didn't want to make my debut, but there were some steps in the middle because it was a very long and twisty process where I didn't feel that way entirely, and I was trying to work on other things that I thought were more likely to be my debut, but I never actually found a book that I was like super convinced would be a better debut than this book, even when I didn't believe in this book, which I guess showed you that like this process is hard, and I'm glad it worked out the way it did because it's not like I had another option that I felt very strongly about at the time. Since I just talked about acquisitions, I'm actually going to jump to a different question from Lanchi Lei, who is my Author Mentor Match Round 9 mentee. Their question was, I'd like to know about what acquisitions is like. Oh, and by the way, if you're interested, she has a whole video about getting into Author Mentor Match and their sort of application process and all of that, which I will link below Alexa Dunn's video, so if you are interested, you can watch that and see about Chi sort of screaming about their mentor match, which was really exciting for me to watch as the mentor that picked them. So anyway, let's talk about acquisitions for a second. Depending on the size of the imprint, the people in the acquisitions meeting changes. Acquisitions meeting is kind of the final step where an imprint decides if they are going to buy your book. And this acquisitions meeting, like I said, has a different flavor depending on the imprint. I know at Scholastic, for instance, the acquisition meetings are kind of a much larger thing because they involve a lot of sort of higher up people in Scholastic, versus at some of the big five, it might only involve the people at the imprint. I'm pretty sure at my imprint, it only involves like the senior editors, unless there is like an assistant or associate editor whose book that they want to buy is on the line for that acquisitions meeting. It might involve marketing people. I don't really know. I'm piecing together things that I've been told about various acquisitions meetings. All I know is that the acquisitions meeting is that final step where the imprint decides that they're going to buy it or not. And it involves more than just the editor who loves it, which is why you hear about, you know, cases where you don't get a book deal even if an editor really loved it, because it gets turned down at acquisitions. That does happen. I don't know what percentage that happens at, but I have personal friends who have been turned down on acquisitions multiple times. It does happen. It's terrible. I was so nervous going into acquisitions because I knew that you could be turned down in acquisitions, and even though my editor, you know, wanted to buy my book, I didn't know if anyone else would be interested or would think it would be a good buy, or if the marketing people thought that they could have a vision to sell it, or if the, you know, head of the imprint was at all interested in including my story in the imprint's reputation. I don't know. There's so much that goes into it, right? But regardless, acquisitions is the last big step, and if you pass acquisitions, you get a book deal, like 99.9% of the time, with some very small exceptions wherein something happens and then they don't end up offering or whatever it may be. So yeah, that's what acquisitions is. I will probably make a whole video sort of talking through the submission process and all of the steps to try to give a little bit more clarity from what I know. I am not an expert. I don't work inside of a publishing house. Those are the people that would know best, but I think some of it is purposefully kept vague, and some of it is maybe not purposefully kept vague, but is vague just because different imprints do it different ways, which is confusing. So hope that helped. The second part of Chi's question was what other projects am I working on right now, which also goes back to Lara's second question, which is, are you working on the adult projects you were working on in previous vlogs? I had two different adult books that I was working on. I had a desert fantasy and a space fantasy. I do still want to write both of those books, but I am taking a pause on my adult stories for now while I kind of let my YA career get its feet under it. I probably won't try to do adult stuff at minimum until late 2023, and more likely I won't start working on adult again until 2024 when my debut is out. So it kind of depends on sort of how quickly I write things like the sequel to my debut and things like that. I think I'm more likely to go back to the space fantasy over the desert fantasy, but I don't really know what I'm going to be feeling at the time in which I'm ready to jump back into adult stuff, so I don't know. The other projects I'm working on right now, I have this book deal that I'm now contractually obligated to work on, so my main priority is finishing Daughter of the Bone Forest because I sold it based on 75 pages and an outline. So I'm finishing draft 6, which my blog just came out for the first part of that if you are interested, and I'm continuing to work on draft 6. And then after I finish Daughter of the Bone Forest, I will need to write the sequel, which is currently titled Daughter of the Witch King. And then when that's done, or when I'm sort of further along in the process of that, my next step is to work on a proposal for my next YA, because I do have an options clause in my contract, which means my editor and my imprint get first look at whatever my next YA novel is, and I have some ideas for what I think I want that to be, but I'm gonna have to work on a proposal, which is the first 50 pages and an outline, something like that. So that's something I'll be working on next year. I recorded my entire Q&A, but apparently my camera cut out halfway through, so I'll re-record my answers to the other questions another time, which means you can ask another question in the comments if you want it to be answered in Q&A part 2.